as soon as I turn on the lens stabilization, that's at 600 millimeters. That truck is really far away. Can a stabilized lens make up for not having a stabilized body? I'm gonna do a few tests and find out right now. The following will be true for whatever camera system you're using, but I'm gonna demonstrate this with Sony cameras. One of the biggest benefits you give up when you buy a more affordable camera like this ZV-E10 over the slightly more expensive A6600 or even more pricey full-frame Sony A7 IV is in-body image stabilization, IBIS. Generally, a camera with IBIS can take the same photos in the same lighting conditions at a much slower shutter speed and still get you perfectly sharp images when you're talking about using the same lens. So that means you can take handheld pictures in darker conditions without having to bump up the ISO, which allows for cleaner, less noisy shots indoors or at night. IBIS is able to do that because the sensor inside the camera is literally dancing around to counteract the motions of your hand, whether that's rotating, tilting, or moving side to side. When your hand is ever so slightly shaking around a little bit, the sensor inside is remaining perfectly still. That makes sense. According to Sony, the IBIS inside this camera will allow you 5 additional stops of stabilization. Theoretically, that should mean that however sharp of a picture I can take with the ZV-E10 with no stabilization and a non-stabilized lens at 1/250 shutter speed, I should be able to take the exact same picture with this camera still without a stabilized lens at 1/8 shutter speed. And that's with all the other settings remaining the same aperture, same ISO, just a super slow shutter speed. This can make up for apparently 5 times the amount of light. I definitely see a clear difference when using IBIS versus not using it. I used to shoot with the Nikon D850 DSLR camera. It did not have any in-body stabilization, and handheld shots of the pits of a race course were a big challenge. I would just crank up the ISO and not care about the noise. So if you take a lot of handheld pictures at night or indoors in darker situations, you might say in-body image stabilization is a clear choice and it's worth the extra money. But that's without considering that you can still get your hands on some image stabilization built into the lens. How do these two compare? Can you basically get the same results as IBIS with a much cheaper camera, just with an extra $100 of stabilization in the lens? As far as I can tell, the ZV-E10 and the A6600 use the same 24.2 megapixel APS-C Exmor CMOS sensor. So when you're paying literally twice as much money for the A6600, you're just paying for the Stabe and the viewfinder. So here I've got a 50mm stabilized lens and a 50mm unstabilized lens. I'm gonna put this cheapo nifty 50 unstabilized lens on my A7 IV that has IBIS, and then this slightly more expensive optically stabilized 50mm on my ZV-E10 that has no in-body stabilization. And see, A, how low can I go on the shutter speed before I'm missing most of the shots? And then B, how much of a difference can you tell between these two stabilization methods? Of course, you can also have a third option where you put a stabilized lens on a stabilized body and you get just ultra stabilization. Even though not as much more as you would think, it's actually only one more stop. The camera will do this cool thing where it uses the lens for tilt stabilization and then the IBIS for rotation stabilization. They just work together. I'll also be taking some shots with no stabilization turned on at all, which actually makes it a big challenge taking pictures indoors. I am glad that I live in an era where this is available. When I say stop for stops of stabilization, I mean a doubling or a halving of the amount of light you need to take the same picture at the same sharpness. So that means you either cut the amount of light in half or you lower the ISO by half. We'll see if all you have to do is spend an extra $100 on the stabilization of this lens versus several hundred, or in this case, several $1,000 for the stabilization in the body of the camera. Of course, if you do stabilize your body, then all lenses are stabilized, and if you're gonna go with an unstabilized body, every lens you buy has to be a stabilized lens to get the stabilization. Then if you did spend the money on a really nice camera and you've got IBIS, how much more of a difference does it make to spend even more money on stabilized lenses on top of that versus just using unstabilized lenses and relying on the body? Because depending on the lens, they get way more expensive for stabilization. The 50 though, that's only $250 versus $350. It's a really nifty 50 lens. I'm in New York City right now in an abandoned floor of a building where some construction project has gone on hold. ZV-E10 with no in-body stabilization and the A7 IV with 5-axis IBIS. There are a ton of these secret locations in New York City, and I'm in one of them right now. If you know exactly which loading dock to walk into at what time, and which staircases to go up, and which hallways you can walk down, if you know which doors you can open and not have a security guard on the other side, and if you know which other doors are plugged open with a little bit of blue tape, I didn't put that there. You can find yourself in one of these large, well-lit open spaces all alone in the middle of a metropolis. We're actually doing lighting and production work for an art fair just below. But really, anyone with the right knowledge could just walk into this giant open space and no one's ever gonna be home. Right below me, there's an art exhibition taking place. I'm gonna go down there with each of these cameras and take some low ISO, slowish shutter speed shots to see if this lens is enough to stabilize this camera to get equal quality pictures as this much more expensive prosumer A7 IV. So here's what I found out. Once you get down into the 1/50 or 1/30 shutter speed territory, without any stabilization at all, lens or IBIS, I started missing shots once in a while. At really slow shutter speeds, it just starts to come down to tiny movements and kind of luck whether or not you hit the shutter button between heartbeats. Interestingly, we all run on a pump that's a muscle that's about the size of your fist. And every time it beats, it's forcing blood into your arms and into your hands, and it makes these tiny little movements just from the hydraulics alone. So way down in the super slow shutter speeds, without any stabilization, you'll still probably nail 1 or 2 shots out of 10, even down at 1/20 shutter speed, if you're standing perfectly still and right after a good exhale. What I found with the stabilized lens with the ZV-E10, at 1/30 shutter speed, I could nail shots every time. 1/20, still most of the time, and even a few at 1/10. Back here at the warehouse, I set up this little test where I could control how dark the room is, and I'm just shooting pictures over and over at different shutter speeds of this stripped down graphics card because it has a bunch of little electrical details, and it's really easy to see if the shot's in focus. The A7 IV with an unstabilized lens did do a tiny bit better than the ZV-E10 with a stabilized lens. But when I say a tiny bit better, I really wouldn't notice the difference shooting around just on the street. In this very controlled environment, I could hit a few more out of 10 with this guy down in the 1/10 shutter speed. And I managed to score a handful of sharp pictures at 1/8. But that's just something I don't require to be possible very often. A 50mm, it turns out, is just pretty easy to score low shutter speed shots, just by the nature of it being somewhat wide in the grand scheme of things. And since these lenses both have an aperture of f1.8, out in public, you'll really never need to shoot that slow. So having in-body image stabilization is better, but unless your budget for a camera body is really high or you just really have to have that EVF, stabilized lens will get the same job done. It gets really interesting with longer lenses where the lens stabilization starts to do a lot more work. When shooting with something like this 600mm lens, the tiny little movements of your hands and arms become really pronounced really far away. Even at shutter speeds at like 1/250, a lot of the pictures will come out blurred from the motion. I was at Daytona International Speedway over this weekend shooting for a race series called Champ Car. I was squatted down at turn 5 looking back down that straight, and you can see here just how shaky the camera is at 600mm. The stabilization only kicks on when you press the shutter halfway down. So when you see the box turn green and the camera has a focus lock, that's when it's got the stability turned on in the lens. You can see it go from very shaky to pretty smooth, even though I'm shooting handheld, I think around 200 to 300 meters away in a squat. But I'll do it here live also so you can see it in action. All the way down at 200mm, you can see it dancing around. I'm holding it as still as I can. But as soon as I press the shutter halfway down, it just locks in solid. No stabe. So with really long lenses, that makes a lot more of a difference. Let's do this at 600 just to hammer home the point. No stabilization. Stabilization. This is as still as I can hold it. And then you press the button and it just fixes everything. And that's not the IBIS doing that either. The really long focal lengths, it's more the lens than the in-body stabilization. I will do it on the ZV-E10 to prove that point. We'll start out with the 50mm because the same thing is still true. So this camera has no in-body stabilization, just with the lens. This is a stabilized lens. Then when I press the shutter halfway down to lock focus, it gets a lot more still. No stabe. You can actually see it sort of like flick on. Here we have 200mm, no stabilization, lens stabilization. See how still that is? So stable. Because of the APS-C, this is even closer too. Yeah, so this camera is lighter. It's way harder to keep steady. As soon as I turn on the lens stabilization, that's at 600mm. That truck is really far away. No stabe. No stabe. Super stabe. It's very impressive. So, what does all this mean? If you're on a budget and you don't want to spring for a super expensive camera body, but you feel like you need some image stabilization in your life, a stabilized lens will do almost as good a job as a stabilized body. And in fact, with these longer lenses, you almost can't tell the difference. Although you really can't consider this a budget-friendly lens either. If you've already got an unstabilized body that you're happy with, for 50 millimeters, pay the extra $100. This lens will be with you for a long time. A lens stays relevant and useful a lot longer than a camera body. Although with this current crop of full-frame Sonys, I really can't ask for much more until we get into AI features, which I guess is already coming with that new ZV-E10 camera. I talked about it over here somewhere. If you've already got a camera with in-body image stabilization, or you're gonna go that route, a stabilized lens will give you even more stabilization, even if not as much more as you might think. And it's still a must with a very long lens anytime other than broad daylight. Pew pew pew!